Hello, and welcome to Crossroads, hosted by Pando, where supply chain experts get together to discuss complex global supply chain problems in today's world. I'm your host, Nimesh Patel, Vice President of Global Alliances and Strategy for Pando.ai. For today's session, we have two special guests from West Monroe, Brian Pacula and Matt Bauke. Thank you, gentlemen, for attending. Before we jump in, let's start with some introductions. Brian, I'll let you go first.
Yep, my name is Brian Pacula. I'm a partner at West Monroe in our Operations Excellence practice, helping clients solve their supply chain issues and optimize it end to end.
Matt Bauke, principal within our Operations Excellence practice, specializing in supply chain, predominantly logistics and distribution.
Great. Well, sounds like we got the right audience. Let's kind of jump into the very first topic. So let's talk about what every CFO and chief supply chain officer has on their mind is managing cost. Since 2020, we've seen supply chain spend and predictability break all norms for multiple reasons, not just a pandemic. And this caused, increased freight rates, labor shortages, manufacturing delays and increases, and now consumer goods price increases. Do you see this stabilizing? And if not, why is this still so important? And how are kind of the exec team managing this?
Yep, yeah, plenty of disruption to go around the past few years. We've had the Baltimore Bridge collapsing, climate impacts as far as flooding in North Carolina. I think last year we had severe storms in Dallas with icing, hurricanes coming through Florida, regional conflicts that are impacting ocean lanes and raw material, et cetera. So a lot of volatility. I don't think we think it's going to slow down anytime soon. Then you got an upcoming election as well that's going to impact policy changes and duties and tariffs. So a lot of headaches for supply chain executives. We saw a recent survey from Wall Street Journal and Gartner. 85% of organizations are ranking supply chain disruption as their top issue in the coming years. So that's a high number, and for it to be top of the list is very meaningful. But as we work with executives and organizations about their supply chain, there's been, some tweaking of their strategy, nearshoring, onshoring, trying to balance the service and cost and sort of resiliency, as well as adoption of technology, trying to get better data at their fingertips to anticipate when disruption is going to happen, resolve it very quickly, as well as just, overall be able to execute their supply chain in a more mature manner. So as we roll forward, everything they've been tackling has primarily been on sort of protecting margins, profit margins, and that means a lot of focus on spend management. And that's where, once again, the additional infusion of technology and GenAI is helping control the creeping cost changes that are coming in. And, the outlet valve really there is the pricing side, right? We're seeing some of that from an inflationary pressure perspective, but they're doing their best to control cost with technology, strategy changes, and doing the best they can, frankly.
All right, Matt. So, Brian hit on a lot of topics across the supply chain. Let's focus in on transportation. Yep. How are transportation execs looking at this problem and based on how they traditionally operated to really kind of overcome the costs that are going to continue to creep up on them?
Absolutely. So all these disruptions we've talked about, logistics organizations are not immune to that, right? If we even look in the last, 2 to 3 months, there have been two huge issues that right now, current ongoing issue with the Red Sea and the crisis that's going on there. That's having a significant impact on transit times globally, as well as the longshoreman strike on the East Coast. Yep. And the even though it was a couple of days, the impacts that had and the potential impact that can have come Q1 of next year. So all of these disruptions are impacting logistics organizations. And what we're seeing and hearing is the major thing organizations and logistics groups are trying to do is how do we build in flexibility into the way that we operate? If these issues and disruptions are going to continue to happen, how do we have flexibility in the way that we operate such that we can respond accordingly as these situations happen, while minimizing any sort of, we talked a lot about spend. How do we build that flexibility in while still minimizing any of the sort of cost impacts that can have?
And the toilet paper shortages still.
Yeah.
So you talked about, especially on the imports, do you continue to see nearshoring as a trend as managing those costs?
Yeah, nearshoring's on the table to make sure that they can control more of their supply chain and have consistent lead times. Obviously, there's a cost structure play there. There's pros and cons, but that's where, more data at your fingertips to be able to do the broader network modeling, network optimization, and balance all those trade-offs. We're seeing more and more technology and advancement around access to data to help make those informed decisions.
Let's double click on the port strike. So like you said, right, there's a big kind of scare. They kind of came to an agreement, fortunately sooner, but it was temporary, right? And I think they have till January 15th. Let's say fast forward, they can't get to a more long-term agreement. The strike goes longer. How do you see that impacting supply chain as people are importing and just domestically managing freight as capacity tightens and I'm sure rates will get impacted?
Yeah, absolutely. With situations like this with strikes and other things, the duration obviously has a huge impact, right? Yep. A quote that I saw was duration amplifies impact. So the longer these types of strikes go on, there's a domino effect that has, sort of trickle down effects throughout the entire supply chain. The shipping giant Maersk even came out a couple weeks ago and said even just a 1 week delay or strike could have a 4 to 6 week delay trickle down effect for the supply chain to right size itself. So all in all, it will have a significant impact in the way that organizations operate, and it could have trickle down effects. The term that I saw used a lot was domino effect, right? So when these types of strikes happen, the immediate ships in port, they're the most immediately impacted. But as the duration goes longer and longer, it has a trickle down effect to ships in transit, and then even in the origin ports, right? You're going to change your sailing schedules because you have such a backlog, and so you get this buildup, which has trickle down effects to inventory levels and organizations' ability to bring goods into the country.
Makes sense. So, these are all great points, and obviously to drive these changes, very time consuming, resource constraining. How do we see kind of GenAI, is that being such a commonly used term and buzzword, is how do we see GenAI, playing into the landscape and changing the way that now customers are thinking about leveraging that in their operations? And Brian, I'll start with maybe a particular topic is carrier collaboration. That's always been a long and arduous process of, figuring out the right way to connect to carriers, communicate. So how do you kind of see GenAI helping shippers manage that?
Yep. Yeah, we're starting to see more and more adoption from our customers, as well as thought leadership that's pushed out there. And I would break it up into two parts, sort of the first part being carrier onboarding, and then you get into more of the management of procurement and RFP life cycles and maintenance, et cetera. So on the onboarding side, it's kind of a infusion of automation as well as de-risking the process. From an automation perspective, it's everything you think of as far as, the chatbot potentially crafting an email, communicating back and forth with the carriers, nudging them along the funnel when they need to provide documentation or answer questions. And then from de-risking the process, typically compliance checks, verification, insurance, things like that. It's either manual or integrated, but now we're seeing the rise of GenAI being able to look at broader market data sets as far as financial history, reputation, performance, and elevate some of those so you know what you might be getting into with some of these carriers, as well as who you may want to focus on more versus focus on less. So a lot of use cases coming to market, and we're seeing more and more traction. I think the second part to this around procurement and the RFP lifecycle is probably where we've seen the most adoption. The ability to look at historical information in your TMS or other data sets as far as lanes, volume, your current rates and the contract, as well as third-party data sets like benchmarking and macro information that you might want to latch onto, to then prescribe what lanes and modes you should source and when, what your target rate should be, and elevating those to a user so that they don't have to go digging for it. And that helps you sort of, when you're at a disadvantage, go out and source really quickly. Where you have the upper hand, you want to keep those rates, and you just need to monitor service levels a little bit more closely. And then back to the automation part again. This is where the chatbot theoretically creates all of the RFP package, communicates with the carrier, analyzes the information when you get it back, pushes all that into the TMS. So it almost becomes a contactless exercise at the end of the day, but we're seeing a lot of infusion where the human is working with the new technology for now. But we could see it eventually getting to more of a black box exercise, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And you bring up a good point, because it's not always about making it easier for the shipper, it's making it easier for the carrier, right? The more friendlier you are as a carrier or shipper of choice, right? The more likely you are you get better responses, better collaboration. Even going back to the onboarding, it's look, how do you even use AI to, automate the mapping and testing, which typically requires carriers to give you dummy data, and that it delays the process. So great points. Matt, moving along the cycle is, let's talk about kind of your day-to-day planning and operations. What opportunities do you see Gen AI helping your transportation users on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think several key areas that we see that are ripe for change in this area, both on the planning, execution, and then what we'll call sort of the post-shipment processes around payment processing and freight audits. On the planning front, as Brian talked about, these predictive and prescriptive models are getting better and better, able to analyze data from a ton of different sources, right? So everything from customer data, looking back, months and years, to even hyper-local data in terms of weather issues, impacts, disruptions, port congestion, like we just talked about. So these models are getting better and better at looking at all of this aggregate data, both specific to a customer and then the areas they operate in, to develop really fine-tuned transportation processes and plans that minimize errors from a planning perspective. Execution as well is, I think, another area. Predictive ETAs, or estimated time of arrivals, are another area where, again, these models are getting better and better. It's allowing organizations to, these models are getting better and better at determining when the shipments will actually come in. And so organizations are able to better respond and plan, right, as issues come up, as a shipment is, let's say, 2 or 3 days late. What real-time impact does that have? What real-time decisions should we make so that we're still fulfilling our customer requirements within our network? So that execution space is another area. And as Brian talked about, right now, a lot of human intervention, but it could be down the road where it's almost more of a black box, where this execution model can directly interface with carriers, right? Collecting in those ETA updates, and then make sure there's proper communication channels with other stakeholder groups like customers. The last area I'll hit on is just the freight payment and audit space. So what do these Gen AI models do, right? They look at large amounts of data and look for trends and issues, right? And so freight payment and audit is a huge area as well, where you've got tons of invoices coming in, right? Typically, someone's manually looking at those invoices and comparing what's on the invoice against our contractual agreement, right? And so when you have this type of technology that can say what actually came in, what were we planning for that cost to be, can then look for the deltas between those numbers, and then interact with the carrier base to work through those issues. So we think that's an area in the near term that'll have a huge impact and allow organizations to reduce manual effort and make sure that they're minimizing excess payment to carriers where that plan versus actual may have been off.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, you said something earlier when you're kind of talking about the planning and forecasting is one thing that isn't probably as commonly used to really lower the risk of getting demand where you need it to be is a synchronization between your supply chain planning, your traditional demand forecasting, inventory planning, and your transportation planning, which is more of your kind of day-to-day, where, again, Gen AI probably could help connect those two systems, which have historically never really talked to each other, to say, hey, here's a forecast, and as you get closer, how do you better predict your operational, transactional, and same thing vice versa? How do you procure more capacity based on a increase in seasonality or so forth? So yeah, I think it plays a great role in merging two probably disparate, concepts that haven't ever really worked together.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Brian, anything else Gen AI can probably help transportation and supply chain leaders with?
Yeah, I think there's two, and it cuts across probably all the functions of supply chain. One would be reporting. We've seen a few use cases out there as far as, hey, you no longer have to go use a canned report that comes from your TMS or WMS or go look in your BI system. It's, looking right through the chatbot or working with prompt engineering to ask a very specific question and getting a very specific answer, right? What was the volume I shipped through the Port of Savannah the last 12 months, right? What is the top product that comes through there? If I have a 2-week delay, what does that do to my production line? So being able to ask these very detail-oriented questions and get specific responses without having to go tap an analyst or ask your IT team to create a new report. So the time to value there is very quick, and it sort of shortcuts usually a lot of hops that you might typically see in an organization. I think the other one is around strategy. So we're starting to see more and more use cases where long-term and medium-range planning, you're starting to look at macro trends and competitor insights through GenAI, but also getting into more tabletop exercises of what-if scenarios. What if I grow 2x? What if I penetrate this market to the tune of X%? What if I have disruption on the East Coast port? Which customers are impacted? Theoretically, a lot of our clients should have been able to go into GenAI and ask questions around what if that port strike had lasted longer, and know which customer population was going to be impacted, how their production lines would be impacted, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we'll see more and more of this as people start to learn the power of GenAI when it comes to supply chain.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So how do you see, I mean, look, I can't imagine anyone saying no to any of these great opportunities with GenAI. As a personal user of now kind of getting adopted to, Chat GPT, for example, and this isn't new, right? This came out years ago. We knew what it could do, but I even still forget on the day-to-day of, hey, it can help me plan a trip somewhere or, research. So how do you see in the business world, again, transportation users or managers leveraging AI now and adopting it, right? Because everyone says they're doing it. There's a lot of vendors out there that are throwing out AI, but what's real in terms of what can they do, and how do they really, again, get more operational using that in their day-to-day decision-making?
Yeah, I think a lot of use cases right now are maybe outside of their core technology stack, and it's looking at broader market information from ChatGPT, et cetera. But as these supply chain technology providers and ERP providers start embedding it in their software product, it'll then become the blend of all the market data that you would get from traditional Google searches, as well as all of the historical information, your contracts, lane history, forecasted volume, and then you start layering that on, now I have production information, I have bill of material. It's very powerful at the end of the day, and it really rivals the human intellect for your best super user that you might have across your supply chain technology stack.
Agreed.
There was a recent survey that the Harvard Business Review did, right? And to a lot of our discussion here, 70% of organizations are still struggling with just, how do I start, right? Where do I go with this? How can I leverage it for my organization? And so simplistically, what we recommend is more of what we'll call a crawl, walk, run approach. And 4 sort of steps within that. The first is to identify what use cases does your organization have for this type of GenAI capability. Typically, you could start with looking at where are immature processes, where are areas where there's the potential for data errors, and just sort of going down that path of determining, how could we potentially leverage this technology. The second is to make sure you have what I'll call your data in order, right? These types of models, they can learn, but at the outset, right, what comes out of these models is only going to be as good as what goes into it. And so I think whatever data set you're trying to analyze for those use cases, making sure that it's as clean as possible is an issue that we frequently see with a lot of customers. So first, start to think through use cases, make sure your data is in order. The third step could be looking into different technology vendors that have capabilities in this space, right? So based on the use cases your organization has, what's the one or multiple different technology vendors that could fit our specific use cases? And then the last step will be the actual implementation itself. That's where sort of this crawl, walk, run comes in. The big focus here, the main recommendation that we have is iteratively implement some of this functionality. Whenever there's a new technology like this, you want to make sure, pick 1 or 2 use cases, implement the technology, work with change management resourcing to make sure whatever change you're trying to introduce with this technology is actually brought into the organization successfully. And then once you have that solid foundation, then iteratively release additional functionality to user groups within your company to increase your maturity in this space.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. And change management is never going to go away. And especially in this crucial arena.
Yep.
Great. So let's wrap it up with a fun question, as I always like to do. So in the past 5 to 7 years, right, we've seen a lot of different trends, right? Visibility, sustainability, resiliency, digital twins, and of course now AI, right? What do you see next coming up? And maybe Matt, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I think one area where there's going to be a lot of opportunity is just autonomous vehicles. I think it'll really, within the next 5 to 10 years, have a significant impact on logistics operations, both from a long haul perspective and then also final mile. So we've already seen, from a customer perspective, right? You look at Tesla and all these consumer vehicles that have autonomous capabilities. That's being extended to the freight space as well, particularly in the immediate term from a long haul perspective. So in the impacts that will have, right, it will reduce labor requirements, which is a constant issue with freight, right, is having enough drivers. And then it will also improve safety across the whole long haul space. And then even from a final mile perspective, drones, right? Both aerial and ground based are going to have a significant impact in logistics operations. It will help with speed and efficiency and even reducing congestion on our roads. So one area for sure that we see is in the near term is autonomous vehicles and how that'll really revolutionize logistics operations.
Yeah, and not that it's new, but I think even more recently, Amazon announced something around investing in autonomous home delivery vehicles, right? And then you got Waymo as well now expanding around their new true driverless cars. So yeah, I fully agree.
Yeah, I think one other area that we think is ripe as well is 3D printing, probably more longer term. But we've talked a lot about all these issues and organizations have as these macroeconomic disruptions happen. A 3D printing model is, let's say the next 10 years, you may have a design for a specific component or end product. Instead of having to deal with all these, transportation requirements, manufacturing requirements across the globe, you could leverage more hyper-local manufacturing facilities and a 3D printing design, and it will really revolutionize the way that our logistics network works, right? Instead of having to ship these, raw materials or finished goods all around the world, right? You're leveraging more of a hyper-local process to reduce a lot of these inefficiencies. That's
a good point. Yeah, I had a vacuum. We'll leave the brand out. But yeah, I had a part go bad, and I've been waiting for 4 weeks just to get that part in. So perfect. Great use case.
I think one other last area that's ripe for opportunity is just what I'll call supply chain sustainability. There's been regulations more so in Europe in this space, but increasingly in the U.S. as well. In the last 6 months or so, California increased some regulations in sustainability, and even the federal government has started to roll out some components here as well. But let's say by 2030, we think sustainable supply chain sustainability is going to be a very big component of how organizations operate. We'll start to see very close to zero emission vehicles throughout these distribution networks. And so it'll really revolutionize the way that logistics operate. What are the drivers of a logistics organization? And a shift to more what I'll call circular supply chain practices, right? A typical supply chain, you have sort of a linear flow. At the end, you've got just, materials going to a waste or a landfill. With these circular supply chain practices, there's an emphasis on recycling and reusing, right? So how can we have a circular flow to our manufacturing processes? So I think sustainability is one area within the next, call it 10 years, that instead of just on-time performance, cost, et cetera, this will be a major lens that organizations and their stakeholders are really focused on.
Yeah. Do you see the U.S. kind of catching up to European standards anytime soon, or you think we'll always kind of be lagging behind?
I think in the near term, and again, Brian talked a lot about some elections and political stuff going on in the short term, so that'll likely have an impact. I think in the, let's call it the next 5 years, I think we will be a bit of a laggard. But you know, a lot of the large sort of Fortune 500 companies are getting pressure from their stakeholder groups, right? So outside of the government side, or outside of the government, you've got all these stakeholders that are feeding these companies and saying, this is an area that we care about. And so I think that pressure will continue to build to the point that it is an area, like I said, in 10 years where it will be a major focus for a supply chain organization.
Agreed. Brian, anything else to add?
Yeah, I'll take more of a technology approach on this one. I think ERP systems, supply chain technology providers, there'll continue to be consolidation and M&A activity in this space, with the goal of being able to control the end-to-end supply chain. So companies will close those gaps. Corber acquired MercuryGate recently, and they continue to try to drive that end-to-end ecosystem, ultimately in search of a consolidated data set that represents the end-to-end supply chain. So then you start adding additional investments on around GenAI, machine learning, control tower functionality. Your back office and your supply chain starts to look a little bit different going forward, right? The human intellect, the tribal knowledge starts to go away. So I think a lot of organizations are going to need to think about how they adopt it, when they adopt it, what are those primary use cases, and then how do they upskill their employees to make sure that they actually drive that adoption and create the value on the back end. I think the other element would be the Tesla We Robot launch last week. Really gets the gears turning as far as, you know, an autonomous vehicle that has a bunch of packages in it, and the humanoid, you know, goes to the back, grabs your box, walks across your lawn, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's smart enough to go up the sidewalk and driveway. And I think that's a game changer, right? Because you're not talking about warehouse control systems or some sort of integration into that robot necessarily. It's going to be smart enough. It's going to have the LLM to sort of understand what its job is and how to act safely. And, oh, I see a dog over there. Don't actually deliver this package. Go put it back. Like, that is the human aspect that, you know, will be less important in the future if those robots actually do what
what you want them to do.
Yeah.
No, and you think about it, and right, I mean, the time studies they do on this is every second matters when you're doing these home deliveries. You think about just when a driver in today's world drops a package, it takes them about a good 10 seconds to take the picture, you know, pull up the app. You know, the robot can be doing that as it walks, right? Those 10 seconds add up to, you know, more and more deliveries and optimization. But no, great point. And even going back, you kind of talked about the consolidation of systems. Yeah, look, you know, it's never an easy task, no matter what anyone says, is, you know, whether it's internal systems you're trying to merge or through M&A, it's a 3 to 5 year architecture engagement to try to consolidate it. And that's where GenAI can speed that up, right? Is, hey, I can start reading that data without a true integrated platform, which is time consuming.
Oh, yeah.
Makes sense. Well, great. I think we'll wrap it up there. I appreciate both of your time, Matt and Brian. Thank you again for coming on the show. Thank you for listeners. Again, if you like to continue watching more of our Crossroads episodes, please tune in to both YouTube and LinkedIn. And thank you again.